we're going to go on to the main story of the day, at least as far as many of our viewers are concerned, which is that just as children head back to class for the new term, dozens of schools are in danger of collapse. And I mean literal collapse, concrete ceilings falling on their heads. Dave, can you take us through this? How is this even possible in the 21st century?
Yeah, so this is essentially, this is a problem that dates back to, in some cases, back to the 60s. Obviously, some of the older school builds were built with material called, let me make sure I'm saying this right, reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete.
It's known as RAC for short, which is a lot easier.
It is, yes, it is much easier. This was it supposedly has a shelf life of about 30 years. Obviously, there's still buildings that have been that are in use much, much, much longer after this time. And with the longer they're in use, without it being, without them being replaced, obviously the risk increases. There was an instance back in Kent in 2018 where part of the school partly collapsed. 4 schools so far this year have been told that they need to close because RAC has been found in their ceilings. And now the Mirror has seen internal memos from the Department for Education showing that warnings are going out to schools saying that they might have to close, they might have to take steps, they might have to use smaller parts of the building, they might have to relocate pupils because of the risk of having to close suddenly because of this. There's around 600 schools where it's potentially been identified, so we're not talking small numbers here.
No.
And the amount of disruption that will come with that can be huge. And this is a problem that, it's not suddenly appeared overnight.
No, exactly. I can remember seeing stuff about this in some of the sort of the niche press for a couple of years. This isn't by any means a recent development, is it? So what this stuff is, everybody, right, is known as RAC. And basically it's a kind of concrete which, instead of being a big load of slop with kind of little bits of rock in it, which is the stuff the Romans used, okay, and which we still use, and which is still holding up a wall in the northeast of England right now, they've been using this kind of concrete where they've actually got air holes in it because it's lighter and it was easier to use and a bit cheaper to make. And there are some images of it. And here is it under pressure. So your general concrete tends to stand up to pressure, but your aerated concrete tends to crumble. And when you put it in water in particular, your actual concrete will sink, your aerated concrete will float. And unfortunately, what this means is that when it gets into water, or let's say your roof leaks a bit or your roof felt's got a tear in it, okay, water gets into your building. It gets around this concrete, which they've made all the ceilings out of, and it starts to not only crumble away the concrete, but corrode the bars that reinforce, the iron bars that reinforce that concrete. And then your school collapses. And unfortunately, in the 1960s, they used this stuff in hospitals, schools, every public building that needed to be built a bit more cheaply and to be as light as possible. And so there's a lot of publicly owned buildings which have got this problem. And according to this story, they've inspected 196 schools already, and they found 65 have this danger of collapse. They need the concrete replacing or knock down and start again, depending how bad it is. By my schoolgirl maths, that's 33% or a third of the schools that they've inspected. But as Dave, you were saying, they think 600 in total might be at risk. And if a third of those have got the same problem, then that's 200 schools that need rebuilding, basically. So I suppose the question is, how much is it? Do they know how much it's going to cost to rebuild or repair them? And is the government going to provide the money to do it?
Well, it's one of those situations. There's no knowing that this is a problem. There's absolutely no excuse not to. The consequences of letting this problem fester on could be absolutely catastrophic. The idea of a school ceiling falling down during a school day is, that's a risk that a government simply cannot take. So, they're essentially going to have to. But the cost of this is going to be absolutely huge. But then, like I said, this isn't an issue that's suddenly come up. This is something that the Department for Education, you would expect, should have been budgeting for quite some time as part of their capital program for replacing buildings. But authorities should have been, should be looking at this as an ongoing thing.
Yeah, but they've all had years of cuts, haven't they? And when you say they should have been budgeting for it, they should have had more money all the way along. They haven't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I mean, we're 5 years on from the school having partially collapsed. You know, like you say, you're absolutely right. That funds should have been in place and prioritised to ensure that this can be addressed, and this can be addressed as a matter of urgency.
Yeah, now this was, so what do you think, everybody? Have you had any children at these schools that have been supposedly affected by this? Get in the comments and let us know. What do you think about it? How are you going to cope if part of the school suddenly does need to be shut down? How's it going to work in your situation? So this is a 20th century building solution, turned out to be temporary. And even though some of this 30-year material has done 60 years or so, it's not going to do another 10. There is billions and billions of pounds that need spending. On the upside, if any politician does say we're going to rebuild all these things, then yes, you've got to spend a lot of money, but you've created loads and loads and loads and loads of jobs. You can present it as an investment in British infrastructure and all the rest of these things. You can even rebuild all those buildings to be green and eco-friendly and solar panels and all the rest of it. And you can make it part of a big flagship policy that is actually something that we all gain from and is positive, as opposed to letting schools fall on kids' heads. But in the meantime, it does look like some schools are having to prepare for near total closure and pupils being sent elsewhere to learn, which means they'll be out of the catchment area. It's making childcare, the school runs more difficult for parents and grandparents. It means time off work, less pay potentially, thousands of people, huge problems, travel issues as well. So it's what I don't understand really, Dave, is that it can't be economic good sense for the government to not foot the bill for this because of the costs. Not just of the PR of a school falling on some children, but the actual the economic cost of having to close down schools and send pupils elsewhere is it's going to be massive. And the government just footed this bill and took the credit for we're going to fix the problem. And let's face it, they can print money when they want to. It just seems a no-brainer. They should just be saying, right, we're going to pay to fix all this straight away. Bang. There you go.
I mean, it's one of those inevitable problems where it's not something that's going to go away. At some point, there will need to be an investment, whether it's when the current government's in place or when someone else succeeds it, or the top team changes in any way. So this isn't this is something that unfortunately they're going to have to grit their teeth and say we have to find the money for this in some way. And with the risks involved, it's going to have to be done pretty soon. And like you say, the longer they do it, if it comes to the point where schools are having to relocate children, where it has a knock-on effect on neighbouring schools, where perhaps they've got to sort of put temporary buildings in place to accommodate more pupils, where suddenly the transport costs go off. There's the costs inherent in that mean that the cost of leaving it becomes even worse.
Exactly. And it's never mind just the potential for tragedy as well. And Leslie says, just think of the huge national debt we've got. We've got no idea where it's been spent. It's certainly not been spent on updating dangerous public buildings like schools. Leslie, we don't know where it's spent. I think Michelle Moan probably knows where some of it's gone. Maybe one day she'll get asked about it. And some of the other people as well. Nadia says, we've had to teach in classrooms full of exposed asbestos and told to close cupboard doors where it is. The conditions in most of the schools I've taught in over the past 20 years are literally falling down. Nadia, for those on podcast, her Facebook profile picture has her drinking what looks like a large glass of wine. And I can understand why, Nadia. If that is your general working conditions, it is pretty appalling. And the local authority schools have been run on shoestrings, as you say, for decades. And it's such a state. And there is only one government that's been in power for the past 13 years that could have sorted some of this out. So I suspect there is going to be a bit of a bloody nose at the next general election if we ever get round to it, and if we're spared that long. Now, the one thing that's amazing to me in this story, Dave, is there's a Department for Education memo which has been seen by the Mirror, as you mentioned, was reported in there, and it's asked for the responsible bodies to come up with contingency plans about how to cope if these schools need to be put out of use, and to come up with that plan before the start of term. But they issued this memo only a few days ago, and I don't know about anyone else, my daughter's school goes back in 2 days, right? They've known about this threat for years. Why have they left it so late to either to inspect them or to warn or to plan? This is something that they should have been doing years ago.
Well, you'd imagine there's going to be an awful lot of head teachers with their heads in their hands at the moment, with everything else that comes with the with schools coming back again after the summer, to have this landed as well. It's, yeah, like you say, I mean, it's, to receive that at any point is a bombshell. But yeah, a few days before the start of term must be an absolute nightmare for the people.
Absolutely astonishing. Yeah, I suspect that probably it's been coming down the line, but someone just hasn't signed off on something until the last minute. And, the fact they've had how many education ministers in the past year? Half a dozen, isn't it? Probably hasn't helped things at all either. I think they had one for about 2 days once, didn't they?
But then also, I mean, for schools in neighbouring areas, I mean, we're not in a state where schools have massive capacity, where you can suddenly have some schools being able to take on hundreds of pupils at very short notice because the school next door is at risk of falling down. It's, the level of planning that would need to go into this goes way beyond the individual schools with the, at risk of collapse themselves.
Yes, exactly. It's not like those children have an infinite number of other schools to go to, unlike if you're paying 40 grand a year for your children's education, like Rishi Sunak is, because you just pick another one, don't you? Anyway, we shall have to see how that all works out. I think I can guess, and probably so can most of us. It seems that 4 schools in Essex and the North East have been told to shut already. So that's more than 1,000 pupils already affected. Very little about it in the news so far. But I think as the term begins and these kind of memos start surfacing, we're going to find this one moves up the news agenda a bit. So there you are, everybody. You've had a quick quick lesson in civil engineering for a Wednesday morning. And remember that for when it does start appearing, because they've known about it for a very long time, and this stuff is pretty bad news.